In the vaults of Switzerland's most prestigious banks, ledgers were balanced, transactions were processed, and a war was financed, not by soldiers, not by weapons dealers, by men in suits, men who asked no questions, men who, to this day, have never been held fully accountable. This is the story of how the world's most respected banking system became the financial backbone of the most destructive regime in human history, and how, for decades, that truth was buried under 50 years of silence, and a mountain of someone else's gold. Somewhere between London, Washington, Bern, and Berlin, there exists a paper trail. It stretches across continents and decades, thousands of pages, classified for half a century, intelligence reports, diplomatic cables, interrogation transcripts from Nuremberg, telegrams sent by desperate Jewish leaders in Switzerland, as they watched helplessly while their communities across Europe were systematically destroyed. These documents, slowly declassified, slowly released, slowly read, tell a story that powerful institutions spent decades hoping would never be told. At the center of this story stands one institution, the Swiss National Bank, the SNB. For centuries, Switzerland had cultivated an image of absolute neutrality, a country beyond the reach of conflict, a sanctuary for wealth, for secrets, for stability. A country so trustworthy that the world deposited its most precious assets within its borders. And in the 1930s and 1940s, as the Third Reich rose to become the most powerful and destructive force Europe had seen since Napoleon, that reputation made Switzerland indispensable. Not as a refuge, not as a peacemaker, but as a financial engine. Here is a question that historians spent decades dancing around. How did Nazi Germany, a regime that began the war with relatively modest gold reserves, manage to fund a 6-year conflict across an entire continent? How did it purchase the tungsten for its shells, the steel for its tanks, the fuel for its aircraft? The answer, laid out in black and white across thousands of declassified documents, is both simple and devastating. It did it with stolen gold, and it converted that stolen gold into usable currency, through Switzerland. A key Allied intelligence document, prepared in February 1946 and titled something along the lines of Allied Claims Against Switzerland for Return of Looted Gold, lays out the mathematics with cold clarity. The figures it contains were built on a complete inventory of gold discovered in Germany at the war's end, cross-referenced against a thorough examination of the Reichsbank's own records. What those records showed was staggering. At minimum, the equivalent of nearly $400 million worth of gold had been transferred from the German Reichsbank to Switzerland during the course of the war. And that figure almost certainly understates the reality. It excludes shipments that occurred before the relevant records were closed and evacuated from Berlin. It excludes earlier wartime transfers recorded in ledgers that were never recovered. And it excludes roughly $12 million worth of Italian gold that the Germans seized following Italy's surrender. Gold that was delivered directly to the Swiss, without even passing through Berlin first. But here's the part that makes this more than just a story about wartime finance. Germany didn't start the war with that kind of gold. Not even close. At the outbreak of hostilities in 1939, the Third Reich's entire gold reserve was estimated at roughly $100 million. By the war's end, German gold had passed through Switzerland to the tune of nearly $650 million. Where did all that extra gold come from? The answer is written in the names of the countries the Third Reich conquered and stripped. Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Holland, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, Luxembourg, Hungary, Italy. Country after country, treasury after treasury, looted, emptied, sent west. And then there was the gold extracted from individual human beings. The rings, the watches, the fillings, all of it flowing through the same financial channels. All of it eventually finding a home in Swiss vaults. Now, the Swiss National Bank's own internal report, produced in 1984 by the bank's own archivist, Robert Vogler, confirms what the Allied intelligence documents assert. Between September 1939 and May 1945, the SNB accepted gold consignments from the Third Reich totaling approximately 1.6 billion Swiss francs. In today's terms, we are speaking of hundreds of millions of dollars. The SNB's own figures align almost precisely with what Allied intelligence had calculated independently. There is no gap between the Swiss version of events and the Allied version. Only a gap between the known facts and what was publicly admitted for 50 years. The Swiss defense, repeated for decades, was simple. We didn't know. We were surrounded. We were neutral. We had no choice. But the paper trail destroys every part of that argument. One by one. Start with what any competent banker should have known. As the manager of one of Europe's central financial hubs, with constant, real-time information about the gold reserves of countries under Nazi occupation, any trained financial professional could have done the arithmetic. Germany's pre-war gold reserves were known quantities. The gold reserves of the countries Germany occupied were also known quantities. When country after country fell under German control, and Berlin's gold holdings suddenly expanded dramatically, and then immediately began flowing into Switzerland, you didn't need a spy network to understand what was happening. You needed a pencil and a ledger. A 1946 Allied intelligence assessment makes this point with unmistakable clarity. Monetary experts across the globe, and Switzerland had some of the finest, were fully aware of the figures surrounding German gold movements. More importantly, Swiss bankers had been explicitly warned, by mid-1943 at the latest, that Germany's pre-war gold stock had been entirely exhausted. This meant one thing and one thing only. Every single bar of gold arriving from Berlin after that point was, by definition, stolen. There was no other explanation. And yet, the gold kept coming. And the Swiss kept accepting it. In June of 1943, a journalist at the Financial Times, a man named Paul Einzig, published an article that sent tremors through the offices of the Swiss National Bank, drawing on an Allied declaration from January of that year, that all property transfers from conquered territories were null and void. Einzig made the argument plainly. Any neutral bank accepting gold from Germany since September 1939 had to assume it was accepting looted gold, because Germany's own reserves had been negligible at the war's start. The reaction in Bern was swift. The following month, July 1943, the SNB's inner circle of key decision-makers convened an emergency meeting. The question on the table was direct. Should the bank continue accepting Nazi gold? The chairman took the position that a gold standard obligated Switzerland to accept gold from any foreign state. Other voices disagreed. The debate was vigorous. And the bank decided, rather than resolve the matter internally, to kick it upstairs. In October 1943, the SNB briefed Switzerland's Federal Council, the equivalent of the country's cabinet, on its gold dealings with the Reichsbank. The briefing included an acknowledgement that certain suspicions about the gold's origins could not be entirely dismissed. The U.S. government had already warned Swiss officials in Washington that the bank could not claim to be acting in good faith. The Federal Council absorbed all of this information. It considered the moral and legal implications. And on the 19th of November, 1943, it sent its reply to the SNB. The Federal Council unanimously endorsed the SNB's existing approach, asking only that future dealings be somewhat reduced in scale. The green light stayed on. Let that sink in. Swiss authorities knew, explicitly, officially, in writing, that the gold being accepted from Nazi Germany was almost certainly stolen. They had been warned by the Allied powers. They had debated it among themselves. And they had decided to continue. As the SNB's own 1984 internal report would later put it, from today's perspective, what the governing board did in 1944 represents a degree of credulity that is genuinely impossible to comprehend. It is hard to understand, the report says, that the SNB's leadership still trusted a regime that was, by that point, openly criminal. To understand how the looting of national gold reserves worked in practice, consider the story of Belgium. When German forces advanced toward Belgium in 1940, the Belgian government took emergency action. It arranged for its gold reserves, then valued at roughly $223 million, to be shipped to France for safekeeping. With the Germans at France's doorstep, the Belgian gold was then transferred further away, to Dakar, capital of French West Africa, what is now Senegal. For a time it seemed the gold was safe. But then France fell, and the collaborationist Vichy regime, doing the bidding of Berlin, ordered the Belgian gold returned. It was loaded onto riverboats, transported by camel train across the Sahara Desert, flown by aircraft to Marseilles. From Marseilles, it traveled to Berlin, where it was melted down, stamped with pre-war markings, to disguise the fact that it had just been seized from a sovereign nation, and then dispatched to Switzerland, to the vaults of the SNB. The SNB's own internal report documents this sequence without flinching. Large quantities of this Belgian gold, it confirms, were recast at the Prussian mint and marked with pre-war stamps, specifically to obscure its true provenance. Precise records of this recast gold show that a specific quantity was then sold directly to the Swiss National Bank. Swiss banking officials asked about this after the war, pointed to the long and deep commercial relationship between Switzerland and Germany. Germany had always been Switzerland's most important trading partner. Before the First World War, after it, and during the Second. The relationship, one official noted, had traditional roots that went far deeper than the Nazi regime itself. That was true. It was also a deflection. Because the traditional roots of a business relationship do not excuse the knowing acceptance of stolen property from a regime engaged in genocide. The most persistent Swiss argument, the one repeated most often by defenders of the wartime banking establishment, was the argument of coercion. Switzerland was surrounded. German forces controlled France, Austria, and most of the rest of continental Europe. What choice did a small landlocked country have? It had to cooperate. Otherwise, invasion. This argument has been carefully examined by independent historians, and it has been found wanting. The fact is, there was no serious Nazi plan to invade Switzerland. Historians and former intelligence officials who have studied the question extensively have concluded that invading Switzerland would have been enormously costly, both militarily and economically. The Swiss army was trained, armed, and prepared to fight a guerrilla campaign from the Alps. Taking Bern would not have been as straightforward as taking Paris. More importantly, invading Switzerland would have collapsed the Swiss franc, destroyed the SNB's international credibility, and in doing so, would have eliminated the Nazis' most valuable financial resource. A neutral, credible, internationally accepted banking system through which to convert stolen gold into usable foreign currency. Hitler himself apparently described Switzerland in private as something between a wart and an irritant on the face of Europe. He had no love for the Swiss, but he needed their banks. And everyone on both sides of the border understood that clearly. As one independent historian advising the U.S. Senate Banking Committee on the matter put it, Switzerland was essential to the Nazis. It was their warehouse of currency. The Nazis needed one thing above all else, hard cash. And the only place they could reliably obtain it was Switzerland. And they knew they could only keep getting it if they left the Swiss alone. The Germans created Swiss dependency. And whose fault was that? The Swiss. In other words, the Swiss weren't trapped. They were partners. And the arrangement suited both sides perfectly. Now here is where the story takes a turn. That sounds more like a thriller novel than a historical documentary. Because by 1944, something extraordinary was happening in the upper echelons of the Nazi command. The war was being lost. Everyone with access to real military intelligence knew it. The Red Army was rolling westward across Poland. Allied forces were pushing through France. Senior German army officers had even attempted to assassinate Hitler in July 1944. A desperate bid by men who had helped lay waste to half a continent. The attempt failed. Hitler survived. But among those watching from the shadows, in the boardrooms of German industry, in the corridors of the SS, a different kind of planning was quietly beginning. Not a plan for victory. A plan for survival. On the 10th of August, 1944, just a month after the failed assassination attempt, over a year before Germany's final surrender, a secret meeting reportedly took place at a hotel in Strasbourg. The hotel was called the Red House. And the document that describes what happened there, stamped secret, and compiled by a U.S. military intelligence officer attached to Allied Supreme Headquarters, is one of the most remarkable pieces of paper to emerge from the entire war. Its subject line reads something like this: Plans by German industrialists to establish underground operations after Germany's defeat. Capital flows to neutral countries. Think about that for a moment. In August 1944, while the Holocaust was still in full operation, while Auschwitz was still running, German industrial and military leaders were meeting to plan what would come after. Not after victory. After defeat. Among those allegedly present were representatives of some of Germany's most powerful industrial conglomerates. Names that anyone familiar with German industry would recognize. Krupp, Messerschmitt, Volkswagen, Rheinmetall. Engineers from factories in Poland and from the German Naval Ministry in Paris. The meeting was presided over by an SS general. And the message delivered at that meeting was stark. Germany could not win the war militarily. Everyone in the room understood this. But the Third Reich's economic power, its industrial capacity, its financial networks, its commercial relationships, could survive defeat. If the right preparations were made. Quietly. Individually. Without attracting attention. Here is what was proposed at the Red House meeting. German industrialists were instructed to begin establishing commercial relationships with foreign firms, particularly in the United States, discreetly, below the radar of Allied intelligence. German factories would create independent technical offices and research bureaus, entirely severed from their parent companies on paper, so that no one could trace the connection. Capital would be moved abroad, primarily to neutral countries. And the financial conduit for this capital flight? Switzerland. The Red House document specifically names two Swiss banks as the primary channels through which this exported capital would flow. The vision articulated at the Red House meeting was audacious. Even as Allied tanks were advancing on Berlin, even as the SS was still operating the crematoria at Auschwitz, a group of Nazi industrialists and military officials was planning the architecture of what they called a new post-war German economic empire. A Fourth Reich, not built on armies, built on capital, hidden in plain sight, routed through Switzerland, invested in neutral countries, ready to be activated once the party was strong enough to reassert control. The German government would allocate large sums to industrialists, for the explicit purpose of establishing secure foreign foundations. Those who cooperated would later be rewarded with contracts and concessions when the party returned to power. And the reach of this plan extended beyond Europe. The Red House document lists American companies with German commercial ties that were allegedly well-positioned to protect German economic interests abroad. Their New York office addresses were distributed to the industrialists in the room. The idea was to use existing transatlantic commercial relationships as cover for the quiet transfer of Nazi capital into the post-war global economy. Now, whether the Fourth Reich plan was ever fully executed, whether it succeeded, whether it failed, whether it was even real or partially fabricated, remains a matter of genuine historical debate. The Red House document has only a single source. Some historians approach it with skepticism. But here is what is not in dispute. Senior Nazi economic officials had explicitly stated, as early as 1943, that they could not function for even 2 months without Swiss banking facilities. The centrality of Switzerland to Nazi financial operations, not just during the war but potentially beyond it, is confirmed by multiple independent sources. The Red House document is simply the most explicit articulation of a relationship that had existed from the very beginning. While all of this was unfolding in Bern and Berlin and Strasbourg, in the cafes and safe houses of Lisbon and Madrid, a different kind of war was being fought. Not with guns. With telegrams and intercepts and briefcases full of coded financial documents. Because Allied intelligence agencies understood something fundamental. Follow the money and you understand the war. The neutral capitals of Europe, Lisbon, Madrid, Bern, Stockholm, were not simply cities sitting out the conflict. They were the financial and intelligence nerve centers of the entire war. Agents of every persuasion swarmed through their hotels and restaurants. Telephones were tapped. Telegrams were copied. Bank employees were bribed. The OSS, the forerunner of today's CIA, was particularly active in monitoring the flow of Nazi money through neutral financial systems. And what they found, documented in intercepted communications with dates and amounts and account numbers, was a picture of systematic financial collaboration between Swiss banks and the Nazi war machine. Not rumor, not speculation. Hard intercepts of actual transactions. One particular U.S. government memorandum, a confidential document prepared for the American mission in Bern, dated January 1945, names 2 of Switzerland's most prominent financial institutions directly: Credit Suisse of Zurich and the Union Bank of Switzerland. According to this document, these banks had supplied the Reichsbank with foreign currency for purposes that went well beyond recognized trade. The intercepts are specific. In just under a month, from early to late August 1944, Credit Suisse made available to the Germans the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars in foreign currency. Transaction after transaction. Documented. Dated. Traceable. The memo concludes that these banks had violated not only the standards of conduct that Allied and British governments had communicated, but even the looser regulations that the Swiss Bankers Association had voluntarily put in place for itself. The trail from Switzerland ran south, through the Pyrenees, into the Iberian Peninsula, into the sunlit, shadowed streets of Madrid and Lisbon, cities that were neutral but neither innocent nor passive. In Madrid, Allied intelligence was closely tracking a German economic operation called Safindus, a financial front company, run by a German businessman. Its actual purpose, to purchase war materials for the Nazi war effort, using funds transmitted through Swiss banks. The Swiss francs and gold that Safindus received were used to buy tungsten, the Spanish tungsten that armed German shells, that hardened German weapons, that killed Allied soldiers. paid for with stolen gold, laundered through Zurich. Tungsten deserves a moment of attention here. Because without it, the Nazi war machine would have run out of certain critical military hardware far sooner than it did. Tungsten, also called wolfram, is one of the hardest and most heat-resistant metals on Earth. It is used in everything from shell casings to armor-piercing rounds to the hardening of steel for military applications. Spain was one of the world's largest producers of tungsten. And through Safindus and similar operations, the Nazis were purchasing Spanish tungsten with Swiss francs. Swiss francs obtained from Swiss banks. Swiss banks stocked with gold that had originally been on someone's finger or in someone's mouth. The chain connecting genocide to battlefield capability was real, documented, and running through Switzerland. Portugal, too, participated in this economy of complicity. The wartime leader of Portugal, António Salazar, a man who made no secret of his admiration for Hitler, built up the Bank of Portugal's gold reserves to nearly 5 times their pre-war value. By the time the conflict ended in December 1944, a State Department memorandum confirmed that Portuguese officials privately admitted to accepting looted gold from Germany, either directly or through Swiss intermediaries. In 1946, a diplomatic dispute erupted between Portugal and the Allied powers, after Lisbon attempted to use looted Nazi gold to pay for Polish coal. When confronted about the possibility that the gold had been stolen from Jewish victims, a Bank of Portugal spokesman offered a response that has echoed through history ever since. He said, "How could you tell? Gold has no race." That sentence was spoken by a bank official in 1946 about gold that had been smelted from the teeth of murdered people. When the war ended, the reckoning came. But slowly, reluctantly, incompletely. At Nuremberg, Nazi economic officials scrambled to blame each other. Reichsbank President Walther Funk, who had personally given tours of the bank's vaults to Nazi officials, proudly displaying the mountains of looted valuables, was convicted of war crimes. His assistant Emil Pohl, who had conducted much of the actual gold business with the Swiss, was also convicted. But the institutions on the other side of those transactions? The banks in Bern and Zurich? They remained open. They remained profitable. And for 50 years they remained largely unexamined. It took a scandal, a genuine, internationally visible, politically impossible to ignore scandal, to force the issue. In 1996, revelations about dormant Holocaust victims' accounts in Swiss banks ignited a global firestorm. Holocaust survivors and their families, people who had been trying for decades to reclaim money their murdered relatives had deposited, were being told the accounts didn't exist, or that the documentation was insufficient, or that the time limit had passed. The chairman of one Swiss banking giant famously described the outstanding balances as peanuts. That word, peanuts, became a symbol of arrogance, of denial, of the determination of a powerful institution to minimize what it had done, and what it owed. The 1996 scandal forced open the archives. And what came out of those archives, in London, in Washington, in Bern, was far worse than unclaimed savings accounts. It was the complete picture of wartime economic collaboration. Declassified Allied intelligence reports, SNB internal memos, diplomatic cables, all of it documenting in precise and damning detail how Switzerland had served as the financial infrastructure of the Nazi war machine, how the looted gold of a dozen conquered nations had flowed through Swiss vaults, how the stolen wealth of millions of murdered individuals had been converted into the currency of war, how Swiss banks had known, and had continued, and how, for half a century, that knowledge had been quietly managed, kept out of public view by a combination of institutional inertia, political convenience, and the comfortable silence of prosperity. There is a phrase that recurs in the documents. It appears in the Allied intelligence reports, in the SNB's own internal assessments, in the testimonies given at Nuremberg. The phrase is, "They must have known." It appears in different forms in different languages, across different decades. But the meaning is always the same. The professionals who handled the gold, the bankers who balanced the ledgers, the officials who drafted the memos, the ministers who approved the policy, they must have known. And knowing they proceeded, not because they had no choice, not because invasion was imminent, not because the mathematics were unclear, but because the profits were real, because the relationship with Germany was profitable and familiar and deeply ingrained, because asking questions was inconvenient, because the gold, once it arrived in Switzerland, looked exactly like any other gold. It was smooth. It was stamped. It was heavy. It gave no hint of where it had come from. or whose tooth it had been. The question that hangs over all of this, the question that historians and ethicists and lawyers and survivors' families have been wrestling with for 30 years, is not simply about money. It is not simply about repayment or reparations or the return of dormant accounts. It is about something deeper. About whether it is possible for an institution, a bank, a government, a nation, to profit from atrocity, and then resume normal operations, as though nothing happened. Whether silence is itself a kind of verdict. Whether prosperity built on complicity ever truly becomes legitimate. When asked about their wartime activities, when journalists, researchers, and government investigators sought answers, some of the world's most prestigious financial institutions declined to engage. One Swiss bank's press officer said, "We are still going through the archives." Another said simply, "We do not comment on single documents. Documents that detailed their role in funding a genocide. Documents stamped objectionable activities by U.S. intelligence. We do not comment on single documents. There is a detail in one of the classified Allied reports that stays with you. It describes the contents of the containers found in the Merkers mine, personal effects, valuables, the possessions of people who were killed. The report notes that some of the items bore engraved names. Others had names scratched out. Someone had taken the time to scratch out the names, to erase the identity of the person the item had belonged to, so that the gold, the ring, the brooch, the watch, would have no history, no origin, no race. That act of erasure, that deliberate removal of a name, is perhaps the most perfect symbol of what Switzerland's wartime banking system made possible. It allowed stolen lives to be laundered into clean capital. It allowed a crime of almost unimaginable scale to be converted into something that looked, in a ledger, like ordinary business, and for 50 years that ledger was closed, until the documents began to speak, until the survivors refused to be silent, until the truth, patient, persistent, documented in thousands of yellowing pages, finally found its way into the light.